Hello everybody and welcome back. We're going to talk today about plant reproduction and response. There is a 10-question quiz that you might just take a look at before you watch this or even have it open while you watch this. In this picture that you see here before yourself are two of my favorite plants. At the top left is a passion flower, which makes a really wonderful edible fruit, and sometimes we make drinks out of it actually. And in the bottom right is the Venus flytrap, and it is closed around those two red little beady eyes of a fly right there. So we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go here, but let's dive right in. Mostly today, I want to talk to you about angiosperm reproduction. So we've talked already quite a bit about reproduction in some of the lower plants, in ferns and mosses and things like that, but today let's talk angiosperms. Now, an angiosperm is a flowering plant. You'll want to know that for the quiz. They have adaptations that are very, very specific for their types of reproduction. Well, first of all, they have flowers, right? So flowers are an amazing feature of plants. And if you look at a flower, the flower itself has these petals on it down there. You can see those labeled. I think most of us are familiar with petals. What you may not know is that a petal is actually just a modified leaf. So plants have found ways to repurpose lots of their structures, and this is really common evolutionarily, that something gets repurposed rather than something new gets created. It's a whole lot easier for evolution to change something to be used for something else rather than to come up with something completely new. So in this case, petals are actually transformed from leaves, and if you know what a cactus looks like, the little spines that are on it, those are actually modified leaves as well. So the leaf has been used to make all kinds of things in a plant. Other features on this, I'm going to go over them because we'll talk about them some in the lab that we're going to do. A stamen is the male portion of the plant. It contains the anther and the filament. The anther is where the pollen is, so that's the stuff that dusts off all over you if you touch a flower. It's the male part. The pistil is the female part, and it's composed of three parts. The stigma is the sticky bit on the top of what's known as the style, which is a stick that kind of pokes up there. And the stigma is where the pollen is going to land, where it will grow down the style to find the ovary and to find an ovule inside the ovary. So the ovule is the egg in there that's going to get fertilized by the male sperm. So those parts all make up the pistil right there. Now we're talking about the sepal, which is also a modified leaf. It's just kind of a protective covering that flaps over top of the petals until the whole flower opens up. So that's the parts of an angiosperm flower. Last time we mentioned a little bit about alternation of generations, and we talked about haploids and diploids. Here's again another picture of a flowering plant doing that. And we've got over there on the left-hand side, the purpley color is the diploid phase, and the haploid phase is the orangish color. The haploid, again, is totally buried away, hidden deep down inside the flower. It's the part that's the pollen, it's the part that's the ovule, right up until the act of fertilization, which in flowering plants is a little bit different. It's a little bit interesting. It's unique. They undergo a process known as double fertilization. So we're going to see something on here called a 3N, a triploid cell nucleus. So let's kind of go through that a little bit. Here is a picture of the gametophytes. So these are the gametes. For instance, in humans, the gametes are the sperm and the eggs, right? So in plants, they have pollen and an ovule. So the male part there at the top is produced at the end of the anthers there. A cell undergoes meiosis, and it's going to divide itself up, okay, into essentially 4 cells when you're done that have half of the DNA that the original cell had. And then it's going to actually undergo a further division inside those little cells. It's just regular old mitosis where it splits into 2 nuclei. So the only thing you have to remember here to take away from this is that an individual grain of pollen, an individual grain, has 2 nuclei in it. So they're capable of fertilizing 2 different things. So So think about that for a second, because down here on the bottom, the female portion is also going to undergo meiosis. Okay, that cell's going to divide up, and it doesn't show you all the individual cells there in the picture. And then it's going to go, those cells are going to go through mitosis. And what we'll end up with after the female divisions here is actually 8 nuclei inside of an individual embryo. Okay, so that's a lot of nuclei inside there. Now, why does the plant go to all this trouble and do all this messy business of having all these extra nuclei inside of its sex cells? Well, the reason for that is called double fertilization. This happens in flowering plants. So, double fertilization, what's going to happen is 2 fertilization events are going to take place. If you look at the picture there, in the left-hand side of it, you see just the female portions of the flower. So at the top of it, a pollen grain has landed, and it grows a tube all the way down the style to try and locate an egg. Okay, it's going to find this ovule down there. Now, as it grows down, there's a generative cell, and then there's a tube nucleus cell. Okay, the tube nucleus is actually going to be doing the growing part of it. And then what happens is the generative cell divides into 2 mitotically, making 2 sperm cells. Okay, so here's the part where we're going to fertilize 2 things. So inside that egg, one of those is going to fertilize the what's going to become the zygote, the baby. Okay, that's on the bottom part of the right-hand side of that picture. It's a little hard to describe without a pointer here. So that's going to become the actual zygote, the baby, but the other one's going to fertilize this other stuff that's going to become what we call the endosperm. Okay, so the endosperm is going to grow, and essentially the cells are going to divide and make more, and it's going to become the food for the baby. So check this out. The point of fertilization, the answer to the question on your quiz, is that the reason there's 2 fertilization events is because one of those fertilizes an embryo, the baby, and the other fertilizes the endosperm, which is what's going to become the food for the baby. And if you look up at that picture of corn in the top right there, you can see just how much of it is actually endosperm. So off in the bottom left-hand side of that kernel of corn is the actual embryo, what's going to be the baby, if you will. And the endosperm will be its food as it starts to grow. Think about a plant sprouting from a seed. Until it gets those first leaves out, it can't produce any food. So its food comes from the seed. Now, what part of the seed do we eat? Well, we eat the whole thing. But what part gives us the most nutrients? The same part that the baby was going to eat, the endosperm. So that's the happy part of the food there for us. That's the part we pop in the popcorn. So double fertilization, 1 part zygote, 1 part endosperm. There you have it. Let's move on to pollination. How do flowering plants spread this pollen around? Well, there's lots of different methods. The 2 biggest have to do with the wind and with animals. Now, wind pollinating plants tend to have very small flowers, and they have lots of them, and they produce gobs and gobs of pollen. That's a picture of ragweed up there in the upper left, and ragweed makes loads of pollen and relies on the wind to blow that pollen to other ragweed plants. Now in the bottom right, the passion flower that I showed you from the beginning is relying on insects. It doesn't make near as much pollen. I mean, there's still a lot. You see it all over the back of that bee there, but it relies on animals like insects and even bats and moths and things like that to move its pollen from one plant to the other. Now, it's a very specific delivery system. It's not just like let it all free in the wind and hope for the best. It's attracting a specific insect, dusting it on its back, and then the insect carries it to the next flower. It's a very pointed method, isn't it? So big, pretty, showy flowers tend to be pollinated by animals like insects, and kind of ugly, tiny little flowers like those green ones in the ragweed up there tend to be pollinated by the wind. Now, which ones are you allergic to? Some of you already know you're allergic to ragweed. Ragweed and plants like it that are wind pollinated are typically where you get your allergies from, because that's the only way you're going to get that pollen up your nose is because it's blowing in the wind. Things like the passion flower aren't blowing their pollen all over the place in the wind. Okay, that's the answer to that next question there in your quiz. Let's talk about different types of reproduction in flowering plants. Flowering plants don't have to undergo sexual reproduction. They can do asexual reproduction as well. So think about this for a second. Asexual reproduction is literally cloning yourself. You're making more copies of yourself. Now, plants do that in a variety of ways. Some plants, part of the plant breaks off and grows anew, so you've got exactly the same identical genetic copy of it. Things like mint, that picture in the top left there, grow by runners, so the root grows along, and all along the root sprout up new plants. Now, you could break that root off, but if you genetically tested those plants, every one of them would be identical to the last one. Now, what's the advantage of this? Reproducing asexually, vegetatively, is you're just making clones. So it's a great advantage for a plant because it can make lots and lots of them very quickly without a lot of energy expended. Okay? Now, when is vegetative reproduction not an advantage? Well, it's not an advantage if the environment suddenly changes. In that case, sexual reproduction is way more of an advantage. It's way more advantageous to have your DNA mixed up a little bit, to maybe have some variation in there. If the environment changes, it gets colder, it gets hotter, it gets more drought-like, it gets more wet, you end up with different versions of the plant, and some of them might have an advantage to survive the new environment. So from that perspective, it's a lot better to have sexual reproduction if the environment's changing. There you have it. Let's talk about fruits. Fruits are developed in angiosperms. They're in fact a unique characteristic of angiosperms. What a fruit is a mature ovary. Okay? In most plants, what happens is the ovary walls thicken to form a fruit that encloses the developing seeds. If you look at the tomato over there, the seeds are those little white things on the inside. The ovary that was surrounding the seeds is the part that ripens and gets sweet, that people like to eat and animals like to eat. So a good question might be, why make an ovary? Why ripen the ovary if you're a plant? Well, first of all, you've got to understand that it's very expensive for a plant to ripen its ovary like that. It's pumping a lot of sugars, a lot of energy into making that fruit. The fruit doesn't really benefit the seed directly, but it does indirectly, because what will happen is animals, like humans, like bears, like raccoons, will eat plants' berries, their ovaries, and inside the berries or the fruits happen to be seeds. So they eat the fleshy part, but they eat the seeds too, and then when they go someplace and take a poop, they poop out the seeds, and it's ready made with fertilizer, so the plant got dispersed. So it's kind of a trick in a way. Plants aren't making fruits because they like us. They're making fruits because they want us to spread their seeds around. So not that plants really want anything, but that's really what the use is for the plant. So for your questions, a fruit is a mature ovary. Yes, when you eat a tomato or you eat other things that you might call a fruit. I know you probably don't call a tomato a fruit, but it technically is. You are eating a ripened, mature ovary of a plant. So I said there are many things we commonly call vegetables are really fruits to a botanist, like peas, corn, rice, peanuts, tomatoes. Those are actually fruits. So interesting. There's other ways that seeds can get dispersed. So let's look at a couple of those, because there's a question on the quiz about this. The chipmunk up there is eating the berry, and like I just said, chipmunks, birds, all sorts of animals, organisms will eat seeds by trying to get the fleshy fruit that's really sweet. So by doing that, he's going to go someplace in the woods and deposit the waste with some fertilizer and grow some new plants. If you look over to the top right, we've got some cockleburrs on this person's sock. And those transport with these little hooks like Velcro, and that's actually where the idea for Velcro came from, by hooking to socks and animal fur, and then the animal will pick them off and deposit them someplace to grow. We can look here down at the bottom left. We've got a dandelion. Many plants rely on the wind to transport, whether they're fluttering through the air or being blown away. They use the wind to end up further away to plant themselves. Down in the bottom right is a unique one. That's the coconut. Now, a coconut doesn't use wind or animal fur or animals eating it to transport. You have to be a pretty big chipmunk to fit that in your mouth. It actually falls off of the tree, rolls into the water from the beach or during a storm, and then floats its way to a new island where it gets buried in the sand and grows a new coconut tree. Coconut trees are pretty interesting. One thing you may not know about coconut trees is that you're never ever supposed to sleep underneath of one. If you find yourself on a desert island, always look up and make sure you're not under a coconut tree, because sometimes the seeds fall off the trees and they will pretty much crush your skull. So never sleep under a coconut tree. Other than that, deserted island life is probably pretty okay. Now, after a seed gets into the ground and finds itself in conditions that are right for growth, it will start something called germination. So germination is the resumption of growth, resuming of growth from a seed. So think about a seed. It can be dried out and be dormant for long periods of time. In some cases, maybe even hundreds of years. We're not really sure sometimes. And then seeds can find themselves in the right place where it's right moisture, right temperature, and they start to germinate. When they start to germinate, a root comes out one direction and a young shoot comes out the other direction. That seed coat swells and cracks, and then it kind of starts to grow. Some seeds actually can't germinate until they pass through the digestive tract of something like a bird. So, for instance, a bird might eat a berry and get the seed inside of it as well. And as the seed passes through the bird's digestive tract, it dissolves enough of the seed coat that when it comes out, it can actually grow. But until that happens, it can't grow. Kind of interesting like that. Let's take a glance here real quick at cotyledons. There's two big groupings of plants called dicots and monocots based on their seeds. The cotyledons are those seed halves there. They're known as the parts of the seed there that contain essentially the endosperm for the plant. And in a bean down there at the bottom, you've probably broken open a bean before and found that it has two halves there. Okay, sometimes these things are called the seed leaves. So as the plant comes up, you'll see these shrivelly things kind of off to the sides of it. That's the plant utilizing the food that's in the cotyledons as they shrivel up and it puts its first leaves out. Corn is a monocot, it's only got one. Okay. Plants also have hormones, just like people do. Their hormones are different than people hormones, but they cause reactions in plants and cause things to happen just like human hormones do. Now, what's interesting is that many plant hormones are actually terribly useful to humans. In fact, many of our medicines come from things like plant hormones. Plants produce things like salicylic acid that you see in that picture. That's actually where we got aspirin from. Many of our painkillers and things like that come originally from plant hormones. Plants produce this stuff and they use it for things. So they also use these to kind of ward off things like other insects that might be attacking them and stuff like that. So let's kind of move along here. Let's look at some things that hormones do in plants. So many plants will produce hormones kind of up near the tips of the plant, and then the hormones will migrate down the plant due essentially to gravity, and they'll change some things about the plants. For instance, they can inhibit bud development in other parts of the plant. Ever wonder why sometimes plants will bloom and only one flower blooms, but then the others don't? And if you know a gardener, you'll know that they go over and they'll pick that first bloom off because then all of the other flowers open up. The reason is because hormones are preventing it. As soon as they take that top open flower off, the others all suddenly open. An auxin, as you see in this picture here, is one type of plant hormone. And I'm going to talk about this one in particular because it's unique for a number of reasons. Firstly, because Darwin and his son Francis discovered it. And secondly, it regulates all sorts of stuff inside the plant. These things form in the tips of seedlings. and they're produced to regulate cell growth, and so they can actually cause a cell to the cells to elongate, which will cause the plant to grow towards the sun. So how do plants grow towards the sun? What happens is that the auxins are produced in the tip of the plant, okay, and then they travel to the part of the plant that needs to elongate, and then it grows and bends. Now, how did they figure out where these things were being produced? Is a pretty famous experiment here. You've got the control on the left there. You've got a plant with the tip cut off. You've got a plant with a cap on the top. You've got a clear cap on the top of one. And then you've got like a little straw over the center section. And you can see that the ones where the tip is exposed to the sunlight all bend towards the sunlight. So this is why we know auxins are produced in the tip of the plant. Here's how they actually stimulate the cell growth. So you can see the part of the plant where you get the more auxin there causes the cells to get longer and longer, and if you make one side longer than the other, the plant bends. So you know this, if you put a plant in the sunlight, you have to turn it every so often, otherwise it bends all one direction. That's happening because the outer cells are getting longer. Let's talk a little bit about how plants know which way is up. It has to do with gravity, which makes growing plants in artificial gravity in space very difficult. So the plant, if you put it horizontally, it will respond to gravity because the auxins in the lower sides of the stem will make those cells elongate. So essentially, gravity causes that auxin to sink to the bottom side of the plant, making it longer and causing it to bend up. Kind of useful, huh? Difficult, like I said, in artificial gravity or in space where you don't have gravity, because you end up with weird things like plants growing into a ball rather than one direction or another, roots growing all over the place. It's a real mess. Auxins also control branching. So when we look at plants, you can see that the branches of this tree are longer at the bottom and shorter up at the top. Okay, so this is known as apical dominance. The lateral buds near the apex, the top, grow more slowly than those near the base of the plant. Now, what happens if you top the tree? If you cut the tip off, what'll happen is it will bush out and probably look quite awful. I know you've seen this on the sides of streets where the power company has come by, where they trim by the power lines and they cut the top of your tree off. And over a few years, the tree no longer looks like its regular tree shape with bigger at the bottom and pointier at the top. It starts to turn into like a bushy ball. It can look pretty silly sometimes. Sometimes you wish they'd rather just cut the whole thing down. So let's talk about trophisms next. There's different types of growth responses in plants. One of them is known as phototrophism. We've mentioned that already. That's growth towards light. Gravitrophism is growth with the roots down and the stems up due to gravity. So that's gravity, gravitrophism, roots down, stems up. Thigmotrophism is a unique one. How do plants know to grow around things like vines? They're actually touch sensitive. And when those tendrils on the vines will rotate around in circles until they bump into something. As soon as they do, they wrap around it, and then the vine starts to go up it. That's known as thigmotrophism. Now, there's also some rapid responses in plants, which are kind of unique. Here's one of my favorites I mentioned already. There he is. Whoop! There he is. So you've got a fly on there, and it looks like the plant is closing its mouth, doesn't it? Now, it's not at all like having muscles. What's actually happening here, and it's the same thing that happens in the mimosa plant, the touch-sensitive plant, is that there's little hairs inside there. You can notice some by the fly's leg, and as soon as he brushes one of those hairs, it triggers a decrease in osmotic pressure, if you remember what that is, in the cells near the base of each of those leaflets. So the mouth part of the Venus flytrap is actually just a modified leaf, is what it essentially is. And those little hairs trigger the cells to change pressure, and that snaps it closed. No muscles involved at all. But it's pretty effective, right? He's going to dissolve that fly and use it because he grows in poor nitrogen conditions. All right, guys, one last thing I want to talk through here is the importance of plants to civilization and just what humans have done. We honestly couldn't be alive in the numbers that we are alive in today if it wasn't for the fact that we developed agriculture. And really, if you think about it, there's only a few plants worldwide that support virtually the entire population of humans. Now, I know we like a lot of variety, but really, rice, wheat, soybeans, corn, potatoes, those plants are what the entire world depends on to live. So it's very important that we develop those and are able to grow those in large amounts. Now, those plants have been changed quite a bit by people, unnaturally. One way we've done that is through something called selective breeding. And if you remember back to the evolution unit, we talked about this already. Remember we mentioned how humans made dogs the way they are? Well, we did the same thing with plants, and it's probably more useful than what we did with dogs. But we've improved our plants and our crops. Sometimes, maybe not even knowingly, done this. And today we do it quite purposefully through genetic engineering. This is teosinte. This is the original ancestor of modern day corn. And the Native Americans actually bred this artificially creating corn. Now you can see how big it is next to that quarter there. It's really tiny stuff. It's got a little tiny little ear. It's still alive today. We can go look at it, and it's the ancestor of our modern day corn. Now another one I want to mention is cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kohlrabi, kale. All of these plants were created by people by modifying the wild mustard. The wild mustard plant is still around today. I was looking at some the other day in my backyard, actually. It's a very common plant, but people selectively bred it. This is not genetic engineering. They just picked the plants that tasted the best, or picked the plants that had the funniest looking bud on them, or the thickest stem, and they created an enlargement or an overgrowth of something. If you look at the cauliflower, the flowers are actually sterile. The broccoli, it suppressed flower development. In the cabbage, suppression of internode growth made it have these funny leaves that all overlap like that. Kale, an enlargement of the leaves, right? So humans have actually done quite a bit, and we're poised to do quite a bit more. So that's it for today, guys. You guys have a good day.